Good evening, everybody, and trusting the Lord for Him to open your ears to what He has to say to you and for me to say what He wants me to say. I'm very grateful, very humbled by the parents that God gave me. And of course, I didn't choose them. Of course, I continually am amazed at what they wrote and how my mother spoke. And so I just continue to be a recipient of the blessing they were to so many. And so I'm just going to share quickly their story, which you know most of from watching Through Gates of Splendor. But I'm going to explain, I guess, my perspective of living in the jungle and what I learned from my mother, and of course, what I've learned from my father just through his writings as an adult. And of course, things that my mother taught me or told me as I was growing up. She often said, Val, you're so much like your dad, which makes me happy to know. But I'm not sure exactly what she was referring to back then because I was small and not or young, and I don't remember specifically how she equated our personalities. I think it's because of a love of adventure, but I also know my mother had a love of adventure. They met each other in college, her senior year and his junior year. And they were both Greek majors. Actually, they might have met when she was a junior. But anyway, they started falling in love her senior year after my father had asked her if she would study Greek with him. She was pretty surprised that he asked her because he was known on campus for telling people not to date and telling people that boy-girl relationships took way too much time, and we were there, or the students were there to study to show themselves approved unto God. Called it the AUG degree, approved unto God. So she was happily surprised to go and study with him, but also wondering what this meant because she had thought God had called her to the single life on the mission field. And he had eventually told her right before graduation that he loved her and that he didn't think he'd be able to marry her because he felt God had called him to the single life on the mission field also. So that was a pretty hard pill or big pill for her to swallow when he told her that he loved her. It wasn't in her categories. She'd been taught by her dad, and her four brothers had been taught very clearly by her dad that they should never tell a woman that they love her unless they are ready to ask her to marry them. And here was my father saying, I'm not sure I can marry you, but I want you to know that I love you. As they sat in a cemetery after a long walk, they sat on a concrete bench, and they talked and were very quiet about thinking of the mystery of dying to self and following Christ. Because my father said we have to die to our feelings after he had told her that he loved her. And as they sat in silence thinking on that, the shadow of a cross, which was on a tombstone behind them, fell between them on the ground in front. And they looked at it and recognized that God had put it there for them to continue to focus on what Jesus had done on the cross for them, which meant that they also had to give up their own rights to themselves or give up their feelings in order to obey him. So they decided when she graduated that it was really my mother's suggestion that they not write at all for 15 weeks. That was through the summertime. She was not going to be coming back to Wheaton. They didn't know when they'd see each other again, but she knew she was probably going to PBI, which was in Alberta, Canada. The Plymouth Prairie Bible Institute is what it's called. And she was going there for Bible study and possibly to teach Greek, but also praying all the time, where do you want me, God? Where should I be going? So when my father gave her a little gift for her graduation, it was the Plymouth Brethren Assembly's little hymnal called the Little Flock Hymnal. And she opened it eagerly when she got back to her room to find out what he might have written inside. And he had only written 2 Timothy 2, 3, and 4. A soldier must not be entangled in civilian affairs. He is to follow the master or the commander. And she realized his message to her was they were to focus on doing what God wanted them to do, period. So waiting and prayer were the hallmarks of the next 5 years. 5 years they were in love, the love becoming more and more intense towards the last 2 years. And for 5 years, they only saw each other 5 times. They wrote letters consistently, practically every 2 to 3 weeks, they were receiving letters from each other. And as I said, waiting and prayer were what they continued to do. When my father was in his junior year at college, he began to keep a journal. And so some of his writings have definitely influenced me and blown me away by their commitment, by his desire to truly die for Christ's sake. So he wrote it one time during his senior year. He was studying Psalm 104, and he wrote this meditation. He makes his ministers a flame of fire, it says in that psalm. Am I ignitable? He asked. God, deliver me from the dread asbestos of other things, in quotes, other things. Saturate me with the oil of the Spirit that I may be a flame. The flame is transient, often short-lived. Canst thou bear this, my soul, short life? In me there dwells the spirit of the great short-lived, in other words, Christ and his short life on earth, whose zeal for God's house consumed him, and he has promised baptism with the Spirit and with fire. Make me thy fuel, flame of God, he wrote. Another time he wrote, Father, if thou wilt let me go to South America to labor with thee and to die, I pray that thou wilt let me go soon, nevertheless, not my will. Now he had heard in his junior year about the Auca Indians in Ecuador, that they were a savage, Stone Age tribe, primitive tribe, knew nothing about the outside world, but that they usually, almost always, killed anybody that came into their territory. Some Shell Oil workers, Shell Oil Company had gone down there for exploration and develop oil plants, I guess, and some workers had been killed because they encroached upon the Auca territory. Now the Aucas are now called Waorani. So I try to remember to continue to call them that, but as I grew up, we knew them as Aucas. They did ask once they became Christians and knew that the world had heard about them from the fact that they had killed the 5 men. They asked that they be called Waorani, which means the people, instead of savage. Auca means savage in the Quechua language. Now my parents first were missionaries to the Quechua Indians, and they were married only 27 months, living among Quechuas, before my father went with the other 4 men and was killed. A few weeks later in his journal, my father wrote, I prayed a strange prayer today, and this prayer has meant a lot to me. I covenanted with the Father that he would do either of 2 things. He would either glorify himself to the utmost in me or slay me. By his grace, I shall not have his second best, for he heard me, I believe, so that now I have nothing to look forward to but a life of sacrificial sonship. Or heaven soon, perhaps tomorrow. What a prospect, he said excitedly. So he was consumed with longing to know and do God's will and to bring the gospel to people who had never heard. He loved to tell American audiences, because he did speak in a lot of assemblies or churches, that Americans don't need a call to the mission field. They need a kick in the seat of their pants. They needed a kick in the seat of their pants. My mother, during those 5 years, was praying specifically, Lord, where do you want me to go? And still not knowing whether she would marry my dad. She thought at first she might be going to Africa, and then she thought she might go to the South Pacific, and then she thought she might be going to India because Amy Carmichael's life and ministry had meant so much to her. Well, God eventually assured her that she was to go to Ecuador also, and she arrived in Ecuador, in Quito, 2 months after my father, his Spanish language study. Another word from my father's journal was, Satan's word is, go and work. And this has a special meaning to my husband and me because we were working so hard for 15 years on being righteous and godly people. But God said, go and sacrifice. The world looks at how much we do and what our work is and whether we're accomplishing anything. So Satan wants to say, go and work. But God says, go and sacrifice. So it's a lifetime of learning, finding out what does that mean to sacrifice ourselves for him. So those quotes really are the main quotes, besides the one that most people know, people hear in missions conferences. My father saying, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. But those quotes that I've read to you from his journal have meant the most to me, because I'm just amazed that at 20 and 21, he was writing things like this, very sure that he was to go to the mission field, and mostly sure that he was to go single, except when he fell in love with my mother and then didn't know what to do with that. So in 1952, they're studying the Spanish language that was required of missionaries to learn Spanish first for 6 months, and they were within a few blocks of each other, both of them staying in a Spanish home. And they got to take walks. They hiked up huge mountain peaks, 10,000, 12,000 feet from Quito. And they thoroughly enjoyed their time together. And at one point, my father actually cried because he was not as fast at learning Spanish as my mother was. She had an amazing ear. She could imitate, but she also had a very quick brain to learn it. So he felt insecure around her at times, especially with her ability to argue very, very wisely, very strongly, and she was right. She was almost 100% of the time right. So I never felt any courage to argue with her. If I did, she could shut me off pretty quickly because her reasoning was so perfect, logical. She, in fact, men often called her, men often would say that she seemed to think and speak like a man because there was not as much emotion in her as there is in most of us women. I would say she could be very emotional, and her heart was very emotional, but she had learned to steel herself against being too touchy-feely and too emotional. And of course, in the 60s and 70s, feelings were becoming more and more important to everybody. And she was beginning to think that's not the way to go. It's about obedience. Doesn't matter how we feel. So as they sat and stared at that shadow of the cross that night before she graduated, they were recognizing we have to die to our feelings. So they get married in October of 1953. They moved into this wonderful house that my father had started building before they got married, and they lived in a tent for 6 months before it was finished. The tent leaked all the time, but they were so happily in love and so happy to be together that it hardly bothered them at all that it leaked. In fact, they had times of hysterics over where it would start leaking, on their bed or on their pillows or right in front of them when they started to sit down to eat. But they had a great time. They both got hepatitis those first 6 months, so they were quite sick, but they were also so completely happy. And so as time went on, my father built this house. They had a lot of discussion of what she wanted in the house, and that house, as far as I know, is still standing. It was standing 40 years later when my mother, my husband and I, and my mother's husband all got to go and visit it. And of course, it brought back so many memories because I loved being in that house until I was 3.5 when we went to live with the Aucas, or the Waodani. We also went back to live with the Quichuas and lived in that house from the time I was 6 until I was 8. So it's a lovely place and had a beautiful view of the river. And I will just never forget the happiness as a jungle kid, running around barefoot, not having very many restrictions except to obey my mother if she called me in for a meal. I had to come in immediately. There was no dallying. There was no, just a minute, Mama. No, it was come immediately. And she expected me to obey that way. So I am so very grateful for what she influenced me with as I grew up. And I would say there were 5 things that she taught me well. I can't say that I'm the perfectly obedient person that I want to be, but these were the things that were her sterling examples of what a Christian should be. Love. She was very loving towards me, always affectionate. We had a special bedtime routine where she spent time with me, telling me Bible stories or reading them to me and singing many wonderful hymns. And she was always affectionate. Her family had not been very affectionate, but she had decided that children need a lot of affection. And she had also learned from the Elliot side, which was a very affectionate family, lots of hugs and lots of kisses. So she was affectionate with me, and she was affectionate with my children. That love showed, of course, in her acceptance of the Auca Indians, just completely accepting where we lived when we moved in, and we had to live in a house with no walls for a whole year. And she slept in a hammock, which she said was more comfortable than a regular bed. But everything else was difficult because she had grown up in a very civilized, proper home where people always wore shoes and, of course, always dressed nicely. And at the table, they always had the polite manners of traditional table manners, and they were very strictly taught how to speak up, how to look at adults, all of those things that we all want to teach our children. So love was definitely a hallmark of her life with me, and love towards the Indians. Now, she would teach me to do chores, and I'm sure I started some in Ecuador. I don't remember them very well, but I know that when we got to New Hampshire, I, as an 8.5-year-old, had to clean one of the bathrooms every week, and I had to dust my room and vacuum my room, and I had to hang up clothes that I didn't want to hang up. I'd always lay my clothes on a chair, and my mother would say, Val, if you put them up immediately, hang them up right away, you wouldn't have a whole pile to do at the end of the day or at the end of the week. She taught the truth to me continually. So scripture reading, and I'll tell you a little story about lying on that bamboo bed next to my mother in her hammock every night. By 6:15 or 6:30, we were asleep. There was no electricity among the Aucas then. So we had the firelight, and because we were very close to the equator, the sun went down by 6:15, the sun came up at 6 every morning. And so she'd read to me and sing to me, and she always taught me that Jesus was our tender shepherd, that he would always be taking care of us and watching over us. So we had a lot of dangerous things in the jungle, and that's what everybody thinks. Oh, I couldn't imagine living in the jungle because of all those snakes and panthers and whatever out there, and piranhas in the water and anacondas. And she just gave me that confidence that the Lord was taking care of us. So I was allowed to walk into the jungle with my friends, and one time went by myself to the little jungle garden plot that the women had started. When I came back all by myself, my mother said, without any alarm in her face, she said, were you afraid as you walked that path? And I said, no. And she said, you weren't afraid of anything? And I said, yeah, jellyfish and tigers. Now, the only reason I knew about jellyfish and tigers was because we had a National Geographic. My mother had shown me those pictures. And so, of course, there were no jellyfish and tigers on that daylight path. There were panthers, but we never talked about them. We knew they prowled around at night. I suppose my mother just taught me that the Lord was taking care of us. I didn't worry about panthers at nighttime, and of course, hadn't seen any terrible movies that would show me what they could do. So one night she sang, Jesus, tender shepherd, hear me. Bless thy little lamb tonight. Through the darkness be thou near me. Keep me safe till morning light. And there are two more verses that I won't sing through for you, but that was my truth that I went to sleep with. The Lord was going to watch over us. And as she woke up during the night, every night she woke up to stir the fire and to push the logs together because we needed the heat from the fire. We were in the foothills of the Andes Mountains, and it was chilly at nighttime. So she pushed the logs together, and that one of those nights, she looked over, as she usually did, at my bed and saw a black circle on my sleeping bag. And she touched it with her stick, hoping that it was a puddle of water because our thatched roof often leaked. And it wasn't a puddle of water, it was a snake. And the snake just slithered off my bed and off into the jungle. So there we are. God totally protected us. We don't know whether it was a poisonous snake. Maybe my mother did, but she never told me. But it was just okay, great. The Lord took care of us. For me, I was just so carefree. I never saw alarm or worry or fear in her. She was careful to do the job of learning the language. She was very careful about everything she did. She did it well, and she did things perfectly, according to my own observation. And so when I had to do a chore, when we moved to New Hampshire, cleaning the bathroom, if I didn't do it well, she'd bring me back to the chore and say, Val, you didn't do this well. You see this? And so I had to do it over again. And I'm glad that she helped me learn that thoroughness, carefulness. But obedience was really expected. It was not a hope so. And I have heard her say many times, children will do what their parents expect them to do. So if you expect them to obey, then you have pretty well behaved children. Yes, they'll have those times of misbehaving and disobedience. But if you expect them to be wild and crazy and show off and do ridiculous things, that's what they're going to do because they get an audience. So she expected me to obey. I grew up being compliant, wanting to please my mother. And when I did disobey, I was brokenhearted over what I had done to disappoint her. But I was so glad that she showed her sorrow instead of anger when I had disobeyed, because that gave me a very tender conscience. So that courage and love of adventure really got into me as I was in the jungle. And I am so, so grateful for those happy years. As she taught me first, second, and third grade, she realized during my third year that I did not care whether I got F's or A's on my tests because I didn't have any peers also trying to get good grades. So she decided then that we would move to the States for my education, an American public education. And we moved to Franconia, New Hampshire, and it was a very happy time. I do remember being a little nervous first days of school, but the Lord had helped my mother find two girls that I could be good friends with, and they were my best friends from then on. Moving on to the rest of my life and how the Lord used all that my mother said and did, as well as her marriage. She married a time when I was almost 14. She married a Presbyterian minister from the Northern Church, and he was a godly, wonderful man. Taught me a lot of wisdom, though I wish I'd learned even more from him. I was a pretty happy-go-lucky and carefree teenager, too. Didn't want to spend too much time studying hard, so school was hard for me because I didn't want to give the time to it that it needed. But my stepfather was a great example to me of, again, the truth, wisdom, carefulness in doing things well, faithfulness. He was a faithful preacher of the word, and we often went to hear him as he was pulpit supply, and he also was a professor at the seminary, which my husband went to. He died only 4.5 years after my mother married him. My mother had only been married 27 months to my dad, and then 4.5 years to my stepdad. And that's a whole nother story of how I learned God's sovereignty in that death, accepting what God had done. So after college, I happily married my husband, who I had said even in high school that I wanted to be a minister's wife and hadn't met him yet. But God gave me a wonderful husband. Funny, I love to laugh, so he is always making me laugh. And we've been married now 44.5 years, and I am still laughing at him. But that sense of adventure was kind of in both of us. And I went into marriage thinking I'm going to have a huge family, and it's all going to be happy and wonderful and fun. Guess what? I had to face my own sin. Then I had to face my children's sin. And then I had to face also my husband's sin. And not that I had to change my husband, but that's what I was trying to do. I remember very clearly my mother sitting us both down when we had just gotten engaged in her home. And she said, you know, you're marrying a sinner and you will hurt each other's feelings. And I thought, no way, I could never do that. But unfortunately, I turned out to be one of those wives that wants to change their husbands. I don't know if any of you are like that. But I turned out to be a wife that was really critical. And for 15 years, I was very, very critical and always trying to give him all kinds of suggestions and ways that he should be changed or he should change. Well, in 15 years of marriage, we were in California. We had moved from Mississippi in 1987 to California. And I went there thinking that's not where I want to be. I want to be overseas in a mission field that would be fun for my kids because I had so much fun, and so did my husband in Africa. But here we were in Southern California, the capital of entertainment, the capital of perfectly manicured lawns and perfect looking houses, but everything sprinkled because it was the desert, sprinkled with water. And I just thought, this is not where I want to be. So for 5 years, both of us were kind of disgruntled, but at the same time thinking we could grow a huge church. We went to a church of 30 people when we first got there. And my husband by 1992 was beginning to think, I'm a complete failure as a pastor. And I was beginning to think I'm a complete failure as a mom. The Lord took us through a study of Galatians. And we learned in that study that we had been living for our reputation, just like the Pharisees. We learned that we had to die to our reputation. And so a huge change occurred when we did that study of Galatians. We began to be much more humble, much more accepting of one another, especially I of my husband. And the Lord showed us his grace, and the Lord showed us that we had to live by his grace and not by our amazingness or by our obedience. We thought we were being obedient, and yet inside we were in turmoil because things weren't turning out the way we wanted. And after 8 children, I was feeling, after actually 7 children is when we started this study, I was feeling like a complete failure as a mom. So the Lord had to use this study, which he did, to help us be honest with ourselves, honest with each other, and recognize that we really had been living for approval rather than for Christ's glory. And so we began to know that phrase, it's all about him, it's not about us. And so I just want to finish with, it's not about who Valerie Elliot Shepard is, it's about who God is and what he has done in each of your lives and what he will continue to do, because he is a God of grace, a God of love, and a God of wisdom. And he is wise in what he brings us through. He is absolutely perfect and sovereign in all that he leads us through. So may you be blessed in learning to love his word, learning to not read his word just because it's a duty, but learning to read it because it is a relationship you are building with your Creator and your Savior, Jesus Christ. May the Lord bless you, and may you be challenged by my parents' story to live only for him and to die to your feelings. God bless.